Welcome back to Beholder to No One. Today I am here with my friend Bill. Yay, you finally are on the show.
Greetings, adventurers!
I've actually talked about Bill a couple of times, probably a little too much.
I would say you've talked about me both overtly, inadvertently, and I've actually influenced many of your stories and probably the podcast at some points as well.
You actually picked our name.
Yes, that is absolutely a true story.
If you want to thank somebody for this existing, thank Bill for encouraging me to actually give it a fucking shot.
Yeah, but give Nikki most of the credit because she followed through. All she asked me was randomly one day in Messenger, "Hey, what's some names for a podcast?" And I said, "How about this?" And we just kept going back and forth, and we settled on that. And then I said, "Okay, see ya, bye."
Then 10 months later, here we are.
Here we are.
So we wanted to talk about, or you wanted to talk about today, role of the DM, design theory, and conflict resolution specifically. But I'm pretty sure we're gonna go off on quite a few other things too. So we have like an hour and a half of just a lot of stuff that we can just talk about.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to cover. There's a lot that's been brought up by so many of your guests that has been amazing. Just so the listeners at home know, I am a big fan of the show, and I gotta really say, some of the guests that Nikki's had on the show, they've just been absolutely wonderful, and it's really propelled me to kind of think about some of the things they've talked about, and some of the things as a DM I wish was covered, and I kind of want to bring it up since I've been playing this game for a long time.
Longer than me, actually.
Yeah, it's
Which
very
most
true.
people on here haven't. And they're like, oh, I've been playing for 2 years, I've been playing for 5 years. And I'm like, I've been playing for 17 years. And they're just like, oh my God.
So we should probably, I guess I should start off there, kind of, like how everyone else does, kind of give I guess my street cred, if you will.
Go for it.
So I've been playing since 1998. So I've been playing the World of Dungeons and Dragons since second edition specifically. I have played from second edition, third edition, fourth edition, fifth edition. I've played Palladium games. I actually played everything Warhammer related. I actually worked for a game company for a brief moment of time. I've done a lot of mechanic design as an indie developer for other people, as well as contribution on the Dungeons Masters Guild. I've also just been someone who's been really a big advocate for the hobby, and I just love Dungeons and Dragons. Period.
And you also play a lot of other games. You've done like Shadowrun, specifically is the one that we've played. We've played Mech Warrior together.
Yes, so I actually have. So I have DM'd games such as Dark Heresy, Death Watch. I've DM'd. Oh man, Shadowrun. I've DM'd Gamma World. I've DM'd Iron Kingdoms. I've DM'd Vampire the Masquerade. I've DM'd Hunter, Hunter the Vigil. I have DM'd a lot of games and a lot of different systems. I am addicted to two things: lore and mechanics. I think they're
Mm-hmm.
wonderful.
Yeah. Actually, it was funny because the reason why I fell in love with Shadowrun was because of the games, which I've mentioned before. But when we played the first time, you actually tweaked it so that it was easier for us to understand it. And you made it like a 5th edition type-esque game where we could all easily jump in and then fall in love with the lore without having to worry about all the mechanics. And I fucking loved that. Honestly, like if it wasn't for that, I don't think I would have fallen as hard as I did for Shadowrun.
So I guess we're gonna. So this is actually one of the biggest talking points that for the listeners at home that me and Nikki kind of go back and forth on. She's talked about this game a lot in the podcast,
I can't help it. I like
Eh,
Pixel, okay?
but she's finally she did correct the yes. So it was 100% based in the world of Shadowrun. So the lore was absolutely brought from the world of Shadowrun into a fifth edition conversion that I built from the bottom up. For the DMs listening at home, what I used as my framework was a older system made by Chris Perkins and Bill Salavic. It was called D20 Modern. It was a third edition spin-off that they made. So it was a lot of converting those rules into the fifth edition playset and then tweaking as I went and doing conversions with my players and homebrewing as I went. So
Well, I had fun, so that's what matters. And I think the rest of the party did too. Everybody else was enjoying it. And I know
that
when we switched to normal rules, it wasn't as well received.
So I kind of jumping into the role of a DM, right? And that's actually probably a good transition to that. Is you have to know your players, number one, and you also have to know when you're talking about getting someone on board to a new system, especially something you're very passionate about. As a storyteller, you have to convey that passion through both your mechanics as well as the lore. And if you know that your players are not going to be adaptive to a new system, and you know that you have the capability, do it. Absolutely make a framework, use some type of system, plagiarize, because the system of Dungeons and Dragons is OGL. So that's anyone listening at home, that's open game license. So absolutely take other frameworks and apply it to make your players fall in love with those campaign settings and those homebrews. And what made that game very special was not only did my players drive that story, but they actually created elements that cause bigger consequences through role play. And also, I mean that by roll of the dice and what they set at the table. And that's really the best kind of game that you want.
Yeah, role playing actually, like, if I love combat too, but role playing is what makes me personally as a player love a game. That's what makes me fall in love with the game. And like, while fighting is fun, and as a DM, I tend to lean heavily on fighting because that's how I started as a DM, and I'm slowly getting away from it. The role playing aspect for me as a player is the one where I'm like, oh yes, I can't wait for that game again.
So before I kind of jump into the role of DM, I kind of want to maybe kind of start in how I got into the game and kind of build off that, if that's okay.
You do you.
So I got into the game very differently than many people did. A lot of people, and I'm very fortunate for Matt Mercer, and I'm very fortunate for those guys at Critical Role. I think the work that they do. Matt's one of us. I don't. I know that there's a lot of people in the hobby that try to compare their games to his. Then that's not fair. But I will say this: Matt's one of us, and he deserves every credit that he gets. And kudos to him. I didn't get involved in the game through social media or anything like that. It was word of mouth, and literally, it was my uncle. My uncle actually had the first edition red box. I played it when I was 8 years old, and I can tell you the game. The game was not even resembled to a traditional Dungeons and Dragons game. It resembled more of what's called a a Monty Hall kind of game. It was completely Monty Python. It was jokes. We had to use a picture of my mom in order to be one of the monsters.
That's great.
And my uncle was just being, we used weird tropes and weird things that obviously we as kids could relate to, and I fell in love with it immediately when I was 8. And a few years later, I lived in New York. I lived in Brooklyn, and my dad was in charge of this VFW post, and he was cleaning out the basement. He just took over as the post commander, and in the basement, it was this corridor. It was almost like, and I really like telling this story. Because it was like a dungeon. This basement was just long and twisted, and the mildew, it had mildew, and it just was dank, and anyone who's been in New York, they know that, like, that gray overcast. And when I went into this room, it was just wall to wall with Dungeons and Dragons books, books from Al Qadim, so Cold Tour, Dark Sun, Planescape, things I've never even imagined or heard about. And I said to my dad, I said, "Hey, Dad, can I get these books?" And he said, "Hey, I was just going to throw them out." So I carried them 40 blocks in hefty bags, and I've been in it ever since. And I really love telling that story to people because there's something magical about this game, and I think it can really change someone's life for the better. And I also think through the art of storytelling and now what has become collaborative storytelling, I think we can really learn a lot about each other and ourselves through the game.
That's actually really true. Yeah.
So when I first started, obviously I was 11, and my games were God, they were they were god awful in comparison to my games now. And when I would design games, I didn't think about mechanics. I didn't think about if if somebody did someone, because you got to remember, second edition, we had what was called THACO. So for those at home, THACO is to hit AC 0. You actually had to roll higher and then deduct the dice roll from the target number. And then if you were in that percentage, if you were in that range, you scored a hit. So I was playing with other 11, 12-year-olds, right? So to me, I would just, I'd fudge a lot of it. I'd be like, yeah, roll the dice, see what happens, and we would do games that were like Dragon Ball Z or Gundam Wing. And I learned a lot from those experiences before I actually went into real Dungeons and Dragon. At the time, it was called the RPGA. And Magic players would know it as what it's taken form as now, because now they control all the Magic card, the competitive card play, but it used to be the RPGA, and it's now, as we know it, the Adventure League. And so I used to be really big into third edition Adventure League, and I learned so much in third edition about mechanics, and because the players at the time, third edition allowed for what was called mid maxing,
Mm-hmm.
and I know, Nikki, you've talked about it extensively on the show, so I'm not going to cover that, but players.
Yeah, I may or may not have extreme feelings about that.
Nikki knows my feeling about mid maxing. She also knows how I feel about power gaming and metagaming. And well, I guess we'll cover that in a little bit. But when I was in that mindset of third edition, I learned, and I went through players trying to optimize and really try to build these characters that were just essentially gods. They were meant to do everything, and that really made me learn mechanics, because I had to figure out ways without cheating to counter that, and how could I be a better mechanic designer. But what I learned was that created the math challenge, and not everyone at the table was there for the meat grinder. There was a few players that really were there for the role playing element. And fourth edition, I saw a lot of people give fourth edition a lot of hate. And what I think is funny from a mechanic standpoint, they took a lot from fourth edition and they brought it into fifth. They just reworded some of the stuff,
Mm-hmm.
so they were able to cleverly hide it. And what I found is that this fifth edition streamlined the rules so much that there's almost this renaissance of role playing at the table in a way that's never really been seen in a long, long time. And I'm really happy to be in the hobby now. And I really think this is the best time to be in the hobby, because the game is focusing on that story element as much as the rules. The rules really are they're just there to be there. So it's really important to kind of understand how the game has evolved, how player styles matter, and how you as a DM have to adapt to your players. So that's kind of how I've changed and grown as a DM over time.
Yeah, that's interesting to know, because like I obviously don't uh see things the same exact way, not in like the sense that it's not true, but just like I don't look at it that way. So when I played 3.5 at first, I didn't min max because I didn't know the system very well. But when we went to like Pathfinder or 3.5 in Pathfinder, and I was playing as an adult and getting to know the system more, I started to recognize that people were doing that when they're like, well, let me find this at 18th book so I can get that one feat that gives me this one ability that makes me super awesome. And it started to annoy me a little bit because I just wanted to play. I just wanted to role play. And I made characters that weren't super amazing at something. They were good at something, but they were like more problematic in certain ways, or would have some type of flaw, which was my favorite thing to do, was have a flaw that like brought more story. And then I didn't play fourth edition, not necessarily because I wasn't interested, but because I actually took a small break between, due to like moving and stuff like that, and not knowing people in the area. And that happened to be when fourth edition was big, or at least out. So when I came back into it, fifth edition was just starting up. And I like fifth edition. It's a lot easier to comprehend when you're not as great at remembering rules and stuff. There's a lot less books to need. I mean, there's a lot of books, but
Yeah, definitely less minutia in this edition than third edition specifically.
yeah, I do miss some of the ability to have all that lore that was in existence, because I know that we talked about before. I'm pretty sure just chatting about when I was doing that Planescapes quest, and I found or was given or whatever, my brain, the Planescapes book, probably from you, and I was doing research, but that was like a third edition book or a second, like it was an old book, and I could find all this information that I needed to make it work for 5th edition. And that was really interesting to me. I kind of wish they would do that again, but at the same time, it's like, oh, it already exists. Do they really need to? Like, it's already there.
That's really an amazing point, Nikki. And I think what's a really interesting, and you kind of you compacted a lot there, so I want to try to go through it in turn. So yes, and I want to clarify my point. In third edition, if you were playing D&D at someone, so back in the day, you kind of went on BBS forums, and you went on. So shout out to the old players who know Giants in the Playground. You used to go onto our RPG forums, and you looked for just anyone locally. They like, hey, I'm looking for players, and you'd go to somebody's house and you play. And typically, when you went to that person's house, that was a homebrew, and homebrew games typically focus more on that interactive storytelling, involves more in that element. When you went to an RPGA event, these were persistent characters. So these were literally, you can take your character who was like level 12, go to a different place in the country with that character, and it was legal. That's what the Adventure League does now. But that was all module, that was very linear, and that was all about a culture of optimization. And that's where you see a lot of the older players, really, they have that kind of optimization mindset. There's a really amazing YouTube channel out there called Nerdarchy. Are you familiar with them?
Mm-mm.
So these are some of the older guys that they've been playing since first edition. I mean, since Chainmail, and they cover a lot of great topics, in particular about that meat grinder kind of games. The Temple of Elemental Evil, the original, Tomb of Annihilation. Those types of modules. The Lost City, Lost Gems of Martech. Those games are really about optimization, about trying to survive. And you mentioned something before on a previous podcast about how much prep work that you do, and like a lot of other DMs, and it's very interesting. A lot of DMs have moved into that more, hey, I'm just going to get ready that day or at table, right? And what we see is that this edition is the perfect edition for this, because you don't have to worry about that minutia. You don't have to worry about those little things. In third edition, man, I was sitting at a table. Now Nikki knows this. For those of you at home, I do about 20 hours of prep for a game.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, so I do, but that's enjoyable to me. That's a lot of fun. I like thinking out the little details of the world, or the little descriptors of the room. I think it's important. Hey, there's a difference between saying, hey, you move 5 feet, or you approach the dais. You approach the dais as the sconce lights. The lights dim very lowly as you smell this rotting flesh that's approaching, and you don't know from what direction, because it hits you all your senses at once, right? That those descriptors. If you prep that descriptor, your players are going to be like, oh man, like you get to see their faces, and it makes it so great. And this edition's perfect for that, because it's really moved away from that, hey, just make an adventure, get going, right? Don John exists. There's so many resources for DMs now online, as well as in the
Mhm.
DMG, where it's really meant to get in, get out, and you can have a blast. You also mentioned what you were just talking about just a few seconds ago, specifically about missing those minutia points, right? I could speak as both someone who has played as with Nikki, but also somebody who has DM for Nikki. Nikki is the type of player who she wants to live in that world. She's
Mhm.
somebody who wants to do everything, wants to see what she can do. She wants to be able to craft stuff. She wants to own businesses. She wants to have relationships. She wants to do that. So, right, there's not always rules for that. And I've been playing a long time, and I know there's a lot of books where from older editions where you can cheat, and you can grab stuff from, and you can use it as a framework. I just want to mention this real quick. As a DM, say yes more than you say no. And if you can't say yes, try to meet your player in the middle as much as you can, and I'll go over that in a bit. The other thing you mentioned was about books. So the issue is, and I know you might not be familiar with this. So in third edition, there was a real saturation in the market of books. They were making so many books when TSR migrated into Wizards that they were almost making a book a week or a book a month.
Oh, jeez.
Right. And so what happened was there was this saturation in the market, and there were so many books, and Wizards wasn't selling. They weren't selling the books. There was a time where players really thought the hobby was going to die. And that's why there was a big that was one of the big reasons OGL came about. So that's why the open game license came, and we saw a big influx of third party content creation and just people creating content because they had to stop doing what they did. And I do agree. I wish we had a Greyhawk campaign setting. I wish we had a Dragonlance campaign setting. We've had Dark Sun in 4th edition, so I don't imagine we're gonna get that anytime soon. But I would love. Yeah, Theros. I know Theros just came out. A lot of people are saying that's very similar to Spelljammer. But I would
Is
love. I love
is
it. Go ahead.
there's a campaign? I don't think it was. Or is it oh no, it's a lore setting, right? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's a campaign book. And Theros, I mean, there a lot of people are saying I have not read it. I'm not a Magic the Gathering player, so that's probably the only book I'm not going to get. I don't have that, and I don't have Guide to Ravnica. I do encourage Ravnica though for those of you guys that are really into Artificers or who are really into Eberron. You can probably really convert that really easily. But yeah, I mean, the lore exists. It's there. But to kind of ask you a question, because you mentioned this before on a previous episode.
Hmm.
How often do you read that lore before you jump into the world?
Not often. I like having it there for when I need it and it's interesting, but I think I read it once 3 years ago and haven't looked at it again.
So I will also now with that information, right? And we're kind of doing a thought experiment here. With that information, does that apply to you as Nikki the player or Nikki the DM?
DM.
Got it. So this is where I kind of fundamentally disagree with kind of how the build the adventure quick thing comes, because Nikki is a amazing DM. I want to be clear on this. And if I can share your first DM experience, if is that okay after the pirate game, is that okay?
Sure.
So Nikki had never ran a non-modular game. She never did it. And I remember, I like to think that I've been kind of a mentor to you in the world of DMing, if anything.
A little bit.
And I remember,
Mostly listening to my my craziness as I'm just like, how do I do words?
yeah, no, and that's okay. Sometimes Nikki will come up to me about mechanics or spells or mostly lore. It's mostly lore. She'll be like, "Hey, Bill, I need something to pull from. What do you think?" And I'll be like, "Oh, use this or use that." So in that game, she was absolutely terrified to do anything that didn't exist in the rule book. She also was afraid that because the pirate game that we were playing in was based in Forgotten Realms. It was based in Baldur's Gate. It was based in Faerun, specifically on the Sword Coast. And she was really worried that she wasn't going to do the lore justice, or she wasn't going to do the realm justice. And I remember something I said to her, and I want to say this to everyone listening. We were playing Nikki's Forgotten Realm, right? We weren't playing the realms. We're playing her version of the realms. As a player, there's kind of like an agreement between the DM, right? That it's an unwritten agreement. It's like, hey, listen, I'm trying to provide you the game and the content. Try to come with me. Don't work against me. And once I kind of told her that, she kind of shifted a lot because she was really like, oh God, I'm so afraid. I'm so afraid. And I was like, don't just roll dice, and give the players what they're looking for, and you're gonna have fun. And the players are gonna have fun.
I was actually really shocked that it worked. I was like, wait, what do you mean you guys had fun? I'm confused.
Yeah, I think there's always that fear, and this is, I think, really prevalent to new DMs. And I will say I've been doing it for over 20 years, and I still get worried about my games. It's because a DM is somebody who really cares about, I think, about other players. You really want to give those people at the table an experience, and you want to give them a good experience. The Dungeon Master's Guide talks about you want to be that DM where people go home and then years later they'll still talk about that character, right? Nikki was in that game with Pixel. That was years ago, and she still talks
Hmm.
about it. It's one of the greatest compliments that
I have
I
character
got.
art of Pixel.
You got a miniature of Pixel. I think
I
it's
did.
wonderful. She's got a Pixel. She actually has a mini of Pixel. It's amazing. It's really great. But
I still need to paint her.
no, yeah, yeah, you absolutely should. She's Pixel. Pixel was such a great character, and it was a lot of fun to kind of build story around Pixel. And so I guess we've been kind of jumping around a lot about the role of DM. So I want to kind of talk about that using Pixel kind of as the model. So Pixel and Nikki, they're two different They're two different entities, right? As a DM, I'm supposed to have an unbiased perspective of the characters, right? Even though I know Nikki influences Pixel, Pixel is still her own autonomous, living, breathing thing in my world. So I have to think about, as a designer and as a storyteller, how do I give opportunities for Pixel to not only excel, but also to be challenged? And how do I, as a storyteller, give Nikki the opportunity to feel morally obligated to the character to do right by her, but also go, am I doing the right decision? Am I doing the right thing? And I can tell you that, in the Dungeon Master Guild, it talks about hack and slash play. It talks about understanding, fudging the dice, or understanding just a role playing group. This is going to come with time to newer players. You really have to understand your players and what your players are looking for. And a lot of people on the podcast have already talked about that session zero. I think it's also important before session zero, before doing the character creation, is if you're doing homebrew, talk with your players and say, hey, what campaign do you guys want to play? It's so important to kind of get an idea of what do the players want, what's the expectation, and then what's your expectation as DM, right? So you really set that pace in storytelling and in mechanic design, but you can't do that without their framework. And I keep saying the word framework because the players, believe it or not, are your framework, and your players, they actually have I think, a harder job than the DM. I know that's going to probably be very radical to hear on the podcast, but players players drive story. Good players drive story.
Hmm.
And as a DM, if you can be reactionary to players, and it's so important, take notes, take observations of your players, take observations of their actions. And don't think of counters for their characters. Think about things that can really excel the character where they have to have a story arc, right? It's so important, I think, as a DM, where for me as a DM, where my players leave the table and they go, man, did I do the right thing? Or man, I don't know what I just did, if it was the right move. Or man, I don't know if I'm going to make it alive next session, right? Now, usually as a DM, I'll tell my players, like using Pixel, I told my players there was they in the world of Shadowrun, you generate a lot of heat if you keep doing run after run after run after run.
Yeah, we didn't listen.
And I told my players, you're like, hey, if you keep doing this, there's consequences to this. There's consequences to this. And that was all out of character knowledge. The players were like, hey, we get it. We just want to learn the world. I said, okay. And they did. They learned hard twice. But we all knew it was coming, right? It wasn't like, hey, you're coming to the session and I'm going to murder all of you. No, it's like, hey, guys, you're probably going to die. So either get your new characters ready ahead of time, or, we're not going to do this session because you're all dead. There's no way you're going to live.
I was honestly surprised at some of the times that we did, and I'm just like, how am I still alive? I am so confused. What is happening?
So and obviously, since we can talk about that, and I really believe this. I know some DMs, they really believe in fudging rolls. I don't. I believe in like the Dungeon Master's Guide says, you are try to remain impartial as best as possible. And if your players know that you're a DM, that I also thinking about it while I'm talking, and Nikki knows this to be true because she sat at my table. I roll my dice in front of my players.
Hmm.
I don't hide my dice. I think there's actually something more compelling when I watch that doom cross their face, or that elation when I roll a one and they're like, haha, and then there's times when my dice have been cold and it's helped the players. And then there's times where we had a player who just died and he made a brand new character in that game where Nikki played Pixel, and he literally showed up to the scene and he got targeted by the sniper and he got headshot, crit hit, and he was killed because it passed his constitution threshold and just killed him outright.
My new friend died.
Yeah, and the players and because of how that scene was playing out, I just I enforce a countdown mechanic. So what I'll do is if we're in that kind of scene, I'll say 10, 9, 8. So because I want my players to, you got to make a choice. We got to keep this combat going, going, going.
I think that was the game where I killed 40 innocent people, wasn't it?
Yes. So what you often say in that story, so it is true. So there were two different systems that she had. So for those of you who've been listening to the podcast, you might be familiar with the story. I won't go too deep into it because I do want to cover these topics, and we're talking a lot about Shadowrun. But no, it's all right. We said we were gonna sidetrack anyway. But so in this game that Nikki played in, there was a sniper who was hired by specifically the Yakuza, and the Yakuza, they tracked him down to the spot. They were meeting with their fixer, and the sniper just started opening fire. And Nikki was just trying to pinpoint. So the weapons in the world of Shadowrun, some of them can be what's called smart linked. So that means that essentially they have a wireless signal. And so Nikki was trying to search for the sniper that way. It's very clever. She pinpointed it, and then she used the sniper's wireless signal to bounce off into the signal into the building. So everything in the world of Shadowrun is called a PAN. So it's a personal area network. So she was able to hack into the building, and she saw that there was two different systems. There was a sprinkler system and a suppression system. So that's part of the story she often forgets.
I don't remember that part, but at the time, in the heat of the moment, I could not tell you what the difference was.
Yes.
I was just like, I don't care, it's suppression, I guess, whatever, just go.
So when she tells that story, she often forgets. Yeah, and it was true. So if you're a player at my table and we're playing Shadowrun, you're gonna feel that pressure. You're gonna feel like, oh God, I need to stay calm, cool, and collected, or I'm going to probably respond how I am in real life because he's putting me in situations where I'm going to die. And so Nikki, I said, "Hey, are you activating the suppression system or the sprinkler system?" And rightfully so, Pixel was like, "Hey, I'm firing off the suppression system." And that's what caused the cannoli. If you think about Demolition Man, when the car, cannolis essentially. And the world of Shadowrun, things aren't built always to specification. I rolled on a mishap table. It went against it went against what Nikki wanted, and obviously, yeah, she killed 40 people, and she also had an alignment shift with that happened.
Yeah, I think we argued about that one. It's like, I
Yeah,
didn't do it on purpose.
yeah. So it's very interesting. I've heard on the podcast before people talk about alignments, and I come from second edition, so alignment shifts not only are they common, but they were enforced. If you were a paladin and you were a lawful good, and you did something that was against your chivalric code, you lost all your abilities. You had to take a Geist, or you had to take an atonement quest, or you were just a fighter. And so that kind of, there's that old mentality of mechanic where sometimes it's fun to enforce that, especially on players that didn't have those systems. But in that world, we all agreed to that. That was something that I didn't just say, hey, alignment shifts now are in effect. My players knew about that ahead of time.
Yeah, I think at the time, I mean, we don't have to get into it, but it's fine. At the time, I was against it, but afterwards, I'm like, oh yeah, that fucking makes sense.
Yeah. So one of the things that I know we've been kind of loosely talking about the role of the DM, but a big part of the DM role, right, is arbitration of rules. And we've heard on the podcast before people talk about that arbitration rule, and I gotta tell you, Nikki, I'm really shocked you've never talked about the high low rule. You've never brought it up.
I use it all the time. I just never think about it. actually. Like, I use it in all of my games that I run. I actually just used it Monday. I was like, hello. I always forget that it exists, though, when I'm talking to people.
So yes, so you might people might know it as even odds, or people might know it as choose your fate. In the world of Deadlands, there's the chip system. There's tons of different mechanics for this type of arbitration. But essentially, what I do, and I've learned this. I actually learned this back in fourth edition. So obviously there's going to be times when the players are going to do something that it doesn't exist. There is no rules, there is no nothing. And I'm the type of DM where if you're at my table, and because of the amount of work that I do and the amount of arbitration that I have to do because of how my players think, I can't always think of every little system. Now I think of a lot of systems. I've created, corporate sponsorship rules. I've created mechanics for building vehicles and how vehicles work. I've created the internet essentially for fifth edition, for our Shadowrun game. But there's gonna be times when the players are gonna shock you, right? So I use a very basic system. You take a D6, you roll it. You before you roll it, you tell the player declare high or low. And typically, what it is it's a narrative tool that I use it for more than anything. And what I'll say is, if you succeed, if you declare appropriately, you'll get something similar, if not the effect you want. If you fail, you get the opposite effect. And what I found, instead of rules lawyering and instead of arguing about arbitrary rules anyway, this actually not only speeds up the game, but this also makes it fair to the player because it's a die roll.
Yeah, I do that a lot when there's something that I can't, I don't know the rule about, or there isn't a specific rule that actually exists. And they're like, oh, well, do they have blah, blah, blah? And it's like something on a creature, or do I find a letter on them? And I'm like, meh, sure, let's find out. High or low, and I'll roll a d6. So I actually really do like that, and I do use it. I never think about it outside of the situations, like I mentioned, but
No, the reason why I definitely wanted to bring it up today, and I wanted to postulate it to the Beholder No One community, is that you- DMs, and I don't even advocate using that system. I advocate don't get bogged down doing rules lawyering at the table. What often happens is you're going to get a little bit of everybody at the table. You're going to get people that are either role play heavy, you're going to get some who are combat heavy, you're going to get a power gamer every now and again, you're going to get that mid maxer, you're going to get those types of people. So instead of taking time away from the game and taking time away from like that moment where it's so important that your players feel that moment in combat or in that role play resolution. Instead of wasting time rolling, looking for rules, arbitrate it quickly, and tell the player like, "Hey, listen, that's the arbitration. If you don't agree with me, we can talk about it after game." And that's where really conflict resolution comes into play, because as the DM, you're going to be in conflict with the players at times, not because you intend to, but because they're not going to agree with an arbitration, they're not going to agree with a ruling, and they're going to argue like, "Hey, listen, well, in my friend's game, that's not how the rules are," right? So it's really important to establish, like I said, that framework ahead of time with your players, and also reiterate expectations with the players. And don't take it personal. Don't take it to where it's offensive to your players. Respect is such important. And as the DM, you really are that pace setter. You're that person that everyone's looking at for not only entertainment, but really like, what are they supposed to be doing at the table, right? So you really have to not only wear many hats, like the book says, the Dungeon Master's Guide, but you also have to really think about being essentially, and Nikki, I'll throw this out to you. What do you think the most utility class is in Dungeons and Dragons?
um I want to say bard or druid. If utility you mean like able to do a little bit of everything. Actually, I go druid if it's a little bit of everything.
I would agree with you. I would also say cleric.
Cleric, I could see as two of the three, and I'm thinking purely from like a MMO type perspective. DPS, I see. I guess. Well, I guess they could with their spells.
So a cleric can front line. A cleric can do offensive and defensive spells. With how the specifically the portfolios now work, they used to be called portfolios. I know now they're called disciplines specifically. And yeah, the DM is like that traditional. You're essentially that old third edition cleric where you need to step in and wear a lot of hats and help the party along. And I kind of want to pose this question to you, Nikki, as someone who's played in my game and who is a DM. Do you think, do you find it better that the player experience is more enjoyable when the person is learning at the table, or do you prefer it where, like, hey, here's the lore ahead of time and go?
I find it more enjoyable learning at the table because it's enveloping, or it's being developed more like a story to the characters. And if there's something that characters would know as like, hey, you're in this world and here's a few things you need to know, then that's something that I think should be done ahead of time. Like, hey, this world is in a constant war, or we're in an apocalypse. Things like that obviously should be told up front. But learning more and more details about the world are things that I like to discover as a play or as a character, especially if my character would have no reason to know that information.
So, believe it or not, I absolutely agree with Nikki. I prefer I prefer as a player learning at the table. But as a player, I am that guy that wants I don't ever get to play anymore. It's very rare. But when I do get to play, I role play. I'm a role player first and a combatant second. And I want to live and breathe in that world. I want to build my character in that world and I want to know about the world. So I look to that storyteller, that DM, that GM to really give me that direction of how I can build my character and how to go. And that's another important part of the DM. Is really is progression of story and character arcs. And one of the things I do as a DM is when I think about story arcs and I think about character design, especially for my players, I kind of write down. I always have my players, and Nikki knows this. I usually get I create a lot of support for my players outside the game. I'll create massive maps, and I'll create massive interaction systems that the players can have outside of the game. So
Hmm.
I'll give opportunities for my players to do role play on on a messaging group, or I'll say, hey, if you create your character with some background, I'll give you some extra XP or I'll give you an item. And Nikki, to her credit, has done it every time.
If I get free shit, of course I'm gonna do it.
Yeah, so obviously, you're incentivizing your players, and I know some DMs are like, well, they should just do it, but listen, they're taking their time out of their day. Give them something for the time. The reason why you're doing it is because you want your player invested in that character. And as a storyteller, it's great when you could take those elements from their background and throw it into the game, where you can throw those little psychological pieces of that character and throw it into the game. I'm really influenced as a storyteller by American philosopher by the name of Joseph Campbell. Are you familiar with him, Nikki?
Mm-mm.
So just Campbell, for those listening, and of course to you, he wrote an amazing book. It was called The Hero's Journey. It's also specifically it's The Man with a Thousand Faces. And what he proposes in this case study that he did, was that every myth is really in relation a monomyth, that all stories have a connecting point, and that every story there's a little element of something in each story that creates a central arc and theme. So what I do as a storyteller is I take that framework of the hero's journey, and I take the information that my players provide me, and I build what they provide me around the framework. So just to touch it briefly, thinking about fantasy, or thinking about Star Wars, or thinking about science fiction, right? There's that call to adventure, right? The hero is in his normal world. So the normal world, usually for Dungeons and Dragons, that's going to be the tavern, right? They're just the players all meet in a tavern, the traditional trope, right? Or usually the DM will set up the scene before the conflict happens, right? And then what happens is the call to adventure happens. This will be someone endowing the hero with the quest, right? They'll say, "Hey, I want you to do this, or somebody's going to say, hey, I need this, cave of goblins taken care of, or hey, there's a dragon menacing the town, right? A lot of the times in traditional storytelling, there is something called the refusal of the call. So I'm going to use Star Wars because a lot of people listening will probably remember this. Luke, when he talks to Ben for the first time, he says like, "Hey, I can't leave. I got to be here. I got to help people, right?" So there's always that, even in Dungeons and Dragons. What's the refusal? It's usually the player saying like, "Hey, how much money?" "Oh, hey,
Hmm.
that's not enough." Or, "Hey, what am I getting for this?" Right? So that's the refusal in D&D. Typically, the players will ask then for aid. So in the hero's journey, that's what they refer to as the supernatural aid. And usually the players will say, "Well, hey, do I get any assistance? Am I going to get healing? Am I going to get potions?" Right? So using this framework, and there's a lot more to it. I mean, we could do an episode just on the hero's journey, but without going too deep into it, I really believe in the hero's journey because you can build an amazing journey for each player where, and I'll use Nikki as an example. She'll never forget Pixel to the day she dies.
It's ironically probably true. Damn it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I really recommend it. I really recommend that people should. This is not advocating anything in particular. This is advocating for storytelling. Read the hero's journey to understand storytelling elements, because we've been doing storytelling as people forever. That's been always been the main mode of communication, and the main mode of understanding things about us. And I'm a big proponent of, as a storyteller, consequentialism. I believe in it extensively. I also believe, are you familiar with Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman?
I am not.
So they are the authors of Dragonlance. Dragonlance is a setting in the D&D, and they wrote an amazing novelization series. But they also created the campaign setting, which is known as Dragonlance.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and Tracy Hickman, particularly, what's very interesting about Tracy Hickman is that he used to blog extensively back in the early 2000s about deonatology and consequentialism. So a lot of philosophical ideas in the world of D&D, but also storytelling. And he's also a man of very deep faith. And he talks about it at great length. And then really what influenced me as a storyteller to identify this is consequentialism in storytelling. And what I do is, when I design something, not only do I think about what the players are going to perceive, but I also think of what are my villains and monsters seeing as well.
Hmm.
What is their perspective? Why? And fifth edition has done this amazingly. I want to, and this didn't exist in traditional Dungeons and Dragons. You really had to kind of think outside the box. You had to really think about motivators for your villains. And I was really influenced with that in mind. I read a book, and I really have to really give credit to this book. It's by Eve Forward. It's called Villains by Necessity. It's an amazing fantasy book, and but it's from the perspective of the villains of the world. And what's great is the book starts off, and spoilers. This is just the intro. This isn't. I'm not going to go into anything crazy. The intro is very traditional. Like the heroes beat the big bad guy, and the world is in peace, and the world is great, and the fields and farmland were fertile and fruitful, and everything was great, and everything was wonderful, and everything was. And it goes dot dot dot, and then you flip the chapter, and it says on the first page, first word, boring. And you start the book from the perspective of this assassin who is sitting in his guild hall. He's armed to the teeth with these poisons and his daggers, and he has this golden blonde hair, but he has to put oil in it because he's worried about stealth. And but he's sitting in this empty guild hall because there's no more work. It doesn't exist anymore because nobody needs assassins anymore in this new world. And
Everything is perfect.
everything's perfect. And what you find out throughout the course of the story is, the good guys, the one character in particular has been manipulating all the bad guys, essentially reprogramming them. And throughout the course of the adventure, you kind of learn about the main protagonist and why they were evil in the world, that when the good guys were trying to fix it. So, like, for example, there's like, to compare it to D&D, there's a character in the story who is essentially a drow priestess of Loth, right? So she's somebody who, in traditional D&D, they're evil. Law, worshippers of Loth and drow, they're evil, right? In the story. But in this world, what we find out is that, yeah, while she was evil and she did terrible things, you find out that the heroes came through her town and slaughtered her husband and her child and everyone she loved dear. And by their actions caused her to get even more villainous and deeper into her faith and became a zealot, right?
Hmm.
So I read that. I remember I was reading it, and it really changed my perspective on consequentialism and understanding, like, when your players are at the table, they should feel the weight of their actions. And even if they don't immediately see the action or the result of the action, they should feel, because they are the main drivers of the story, that what they did affected something or somebody in that world. And Shadowrun, and using Shadowrun kind of as our framework, because Nikki has played in my Shadowrun game. Shadowrun is a microcosm of there's always a bigger fish than you. There's always a bigger fish, and you can attempt to be the big fish, but there's always a bigger fish. And it's about learning how to survive in that world where, either you're living in a reciprocal relationship or you're an opportunist. Because if you're the predator, eventually you're gonna attract that apex predator, right? So, Nikki, I mean, I think it's fair to say that I have probably put you in situations where it was almost anxious at times.
A little bit. Like,
And
it might have been, like, the meat hook one, that was one,
right, I mean,
to name one of the
yeah,
many.
yeah, I mean, there are times where, so Nikki did certain actions with that character where I wrote charts for all my characters, kind of decisions. I used the Dungeon Master's Guide to kind of think about, specifically in chapter 8, it talks about thinking about how your villains are either, how your NPCs, either they're friendly, indifferent, or hostile, right? Once I kind of took that framework, I kind of built reactions for what these characters would do. And every time the players did something in my game, I rolled for each character an outcome for their story. And sometimes Nikki was the driving factor. Sometimes we had a character played by this gentleman Jason, who he was a driving force of a lot of the bad things that happened in the game, and not because he intended it, but because of his affiliations and what he did to bring that kind of. So one thing Nikki doesn't talk about in the story is that Jason was a yakuza. He was actually an active member of this rival gang that her main love interest was against.
Mhm.
And because of his association, and because they were working for the O'Malleys and they were working for the Irish mob, this caused massive conflict. And this wasn't anything that Nikki or Jason planned. They didn't think of it because they were learning the world as they went. But what they realized immediately, probably about 3, 4 games in, was that, oh my God, this is a thing and we didn't think about this.
Yeah, I think it was when I was brought to my love interest home the first time and introduced to her mom, and then you told me who that was, and I'm like, "Shit."
Yeah, so yeah, and I think it's so important to build off those conflicts that the players, like. I've often postulated as a DM. You think about that classic trope in character creation, right? There's always that guy, and everyone knows it. Everyone listening knows this guy or girl. It's, hey, I have my ancestral weapon. Was my father's 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 blade. It has been in our family for generations. I will use it to defend my home, my honor, and my life forever. Then he goes on his first adventure. DM's like, hey, you got a +1 dagger. And what happens? The guy goes, oh, +1 dagger. And he never uses that sword ever again.
Fuck that sword.
Right. It becomes that amazing story, amazing thing becomes minute. And I've always believed as a storyteller, always make those little decisions matter to your player, but give them reasons why they matter. Give them the empowerment to do that. Give them the ability. Like what every time in character creation, to word this appropriately, I always design things where players always will have strengths and flaws. In third edition, Unearthed Arcana used to have the flaw system, which I adopted into fifth. And the Dungeon Master's Guide also has flaws that you can bring into it. These are optional rules. I don't encourage it for newer players. I encourage it for people who are more interested in flawed characters and who are more interested in challenging systems to overcome them. It's like taking your gaming to the next level, right? Don't do it if you're new. I don't recommend it to a new DM. You're just opening yourself for a world of hurt from your players.
And just to clarify, these are different flaws than like the personality flaws.
Oh yeah, 100%. Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. These are more like if you're weak, you take a -2 to your strength. You have bad eyesight, so you actually get a -2 to your ranged attack rolls, things like that.
Oh, right. Yeah, okay. I remember using that that came into play. I think it was a different Shadowrun game, but when I played the character that had like a 7 strength, and then I got weak, and I had like 2 more negative strengths.
Yep.
I ended up with like a 5, but I made the coolest ass wheelchair for that character.
Yeah, we
way too
homebrewed.
much money.
Yeah, we homebrewed that wheelchair. We gave it like a whole bunch of weapons. We gave it like this scorpion tail that came out with an auto targeting gun that had a smart gun system built. It was amazing. It really was. But that's what I mean. We embraced that weakness, right?
Mm-hmm.
We made that into a strength in its own way, but we also made it to where obviously if Nikki's character had lost that wheelchair, now that puts her into a compromising, right? That puts her into real tension of the scene.
Mm-hmm.
And I think tension matters. And I also when I mean by tension, I mean you are not there to torture people. I want to be very clear. That's not the point of our game and our hobby. The point is that if you're doing an interactive story, and we think about all the good stories that were influenced by real mediums, whether it be television or books or video games, you want to feel like you're in it, and you want to feel that rush and that adrenaline and that feeling of overcoming the big baddie. And there's nothing better when you have 2 hit points and you don't know if the next hit's going to take him down or not. And you're hoping that dice is going to come out on top. There's nothing better.
Yeah, or when you like survive at the very last second, despite the odds, type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's something really great about that, and I think there's something really great, and that's why I advocate. I don't advocate for systems that don't have dice mechanics. I don't. I think they open yourself up to the arguments. There should always be a dice mechanic. I think it's just good fairness. Also, it just allows for that really randomness of the game. It allows for stories like and Nikki, I know you've been DMing a whole lot, and I know you've grown so much as both a player and as a storyteller. I mean, how many stories do you know and that you've been through yourself where they were better because somebody failed a roll?
Probably somewhere in all of them.
So I absolutely agree with Nikki.
At the moment, it doesn't seem like it, but sometimes it takes a bit to recognize that it's better.
So, do you remember the Shadowrun game we were in where Jason? It was a different Shadowrun game. Remember the one where Jason crashed the car?
Yes.
So we had a player, Jason, who also played in this other game, and he crit failed on a drive roll. Now, for those who actually play Shadowrun, I already know the comments are going to be, well, wait a minute, he could have just auto passed that. That was a minute roll. I get it. We don't do that. I make my players all he had to do. He had a +7 to the roll. I want to be clear. So he had the ability. He just had to roll higher. He just had to roll good. He just not crit glitch, right? So a 1. He rolled a 1. So in the world of World of Shadowrun, glitching is never good. World of D&D, typically ones aren't good. So I said, okay, well, roll for deviation, and we're gonna roll to see how bad the crash is. He rolled a 1 again.
Mhm.
Because he rolled a 1 and he crashed the vehicle into a pizzeria, it turned the game into a reactionary escalation of insanity that turned into them having to do the run because the cops showed up to deal with this guy who crashed his vehicle and who provided a fake ID to the cops. The cops saw through it, and essentially, instead of them getting compromised by the cops, the players, including Nikki, show up to try to steal the goods from this jewelry store, and it just turns into all out craziness. And I think it made it better because the player crit failed.
Made it way more interesting, at least. At the time, we're like, Jesus, stop it. Stop rolling.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, a lot of players were really upset and angry.
It's like, you're just making it worse. Stop it.
Yeah, no. So I'm a big proponent. I'm a big proponent of letting people fail. I think there's something great about failure, and also be okay. I've seen something very interesting in the hobby recently, where some DMs get really angry when the players succeed, and to me, I'm like, I think it's great. I love it when somebody rolls a crit 20 on the big baddie and they weren't supposed to, right? Like you think about the CR ratings, and you think about all those little things, and then someone says, "Hey, I'm gonna use presentation in a very interesting way," and you're like, "Oh, oh, God."
Yeah, I have a hard disconnect sometimes with it. I want my players to succeed, and I know that they're having more fun, but at the same time, the back of my head, it's going on like, did I not plan well enough? Did I not like balance the fight well enough, and it wasn't a challenge because of X? When in actuality, it's just like luck of the rolls, and logically, I know that. And afterwards, I'm like, no, it was just the dice. The dice decided that that was possible. So I have a hard time with that sometimes. And I know that it can be heard in my voice because I'm not great at hiding my emotions sometimes. So people are like, I'm sorry that we upset you. I'm like, no, you're fine. Like, you guys did fantastic. That was fucking epic. Please keep doing it. And then I joke that I'm going to try to make it more difficult next time. So it's like, I wonder if I could throw 4 times deadly at you. I mean, you took 3 times deadly and you were fine. What if I did 4 times deadly? They're like, "Are you trying to kill us?" And I'm like, "It's an experiment. I just want to experiment."
So I know you talked about it in previous episodes, and I know you know, and obviously we I don't think we're gonna have time to talk about CRs and things like that, but you're right. You can easily imbalance a combat, very quickly, and you can also make it to where action economy, which we haven't even talked about, right? So action economy could be in benefit, and it really should be in the benefit of the players for the most part. And you're absolutely right. You're 100% right. But me as a DM, when I go into a game, I think two things. I want my players to succeed, and I want my players to die. I think both things. I think I want my players to feel like there is a chance their character's going to die tonight. But I also want them to feel that because when they overcome the challenge, it's going to feel that much better.
Yeah. And that makes sense.
Yeah, so I mean, I really believe in that kind of storytelling. I really believe in it, and it's very interesting. Usually, I stay away from darker storytelling and those type of consequentialism elements from D&D because obviously we all like to fall into that high fantasy trope, that Lord of the Rings, that Camelot, that Canterbury Tales kind of storytelling, and I have to really applaud Wizards of the Coast in fifth edition because modules like Descent into Avernus, it really takes us back to some of the stuff that like from Planescape, which really dealt with the philosophy and the moral conundrums of our decisions and actions, and really questioning it. I'd be very curious in the whole front of the community, and I would love to hear what other people think, and obviously take the discussion onto Twitter or to wherever, and bring it up with Nikki, please, and to Greg, about you know are there players that really using Descent to Avernus as a kind of a framework? Do players go into that adventure with the intention to try to be as good as possible, or do they go into that with the intention to be evil? And I really would love to know on the whole front. Like, how many players in this edition really embrace evil, or do they embrace that good? And like, do they try to be good even when it's so hard? Are they like the shining Captain America, or do they say, "Nah, screw it, I'm gonna burn it all down"?
I think personally, I usually lean towards the screw it, burn it all down type of person. But I have played characters where they are. I never play lawful good. Like we've had that conversation, I think, where I don't think I'll ever play lawful good, at least not on purpose, unless I'm trying to challenge myself, I think. But I usually go for chaotic good just because it's more interesting to me as a player. But we did play Descent into Avernus, and our party as a whole tended to be more chaotic and more neutral, and that led to more like, why should we help you? And it did not work. Well, ultimately Keith was running the game, and he's just like, make new characters. Like, I don't have time to. He basically was like, I don't want to rewrite the story. I want to run this game for people who are trying to do good, not me fighting you constantly across the path to do better or to help.
And
Which makes sense, but
absolutely makes sense. And to Keith's credit, and I'm glad you said that. I want to, and I'm really mean this, because as a DM, he did the right thing. He realized, like, hey, wait a minute, this is going off the rails. I can't control it anymore, guys. Help me out here.
mhm.
And that was brilliant on his part. And to DMs at home, and new DMs, or people who want to become dungeon masters, so because we need them. This hobby needs DMs more than we need players. There's there's always an abundance of players. There's so many people afraid of dungeon mastering because they don't want to, nobody wants to look like a fool in front of their friends. But remember, we're all at a table screaming and yelling about imaginary things. So it's kind of foolish when you think about it, right? So you're in a safe environment.
Mhm.
It's okay to say, "Hey, I'm struggling because of your guys' actions. Help me out." And to applaud Keith, I think that was a great move, and I think because of it, he was in a group of people he trusted, he respected, and obviously, you guys were like, "Oh, okay, sure."
Yeah, pretty much. We're like, okay, we got to make new characters. That's fine.
Yeah. I mean, and that's happened. I mean, we've played games where I was the DM for, where we got into that threshold. I mean, we did that. We did a Undermountain game. We did that as a one shotter, right?
Mhm.
And that game was, we did it just to, all hang out. And I said, like, hey, listen, this game, you're gonna die, like, point blank, you're gonna die. Yeah, but it's to see how long you last, essentially. And
Yeah.
you know,
I had to do that in my own. I only am DMing one game right now, but there was a time where I'm like, look, we gotta change tactics, or because this is getting out of my comfort zone. And it wasn't more. It was less in a comfort zone of like, we're going too dark. It was more of a like, I don't know how to do political entry and conversations, and I don't want to figure it out. So can we just like not do that? Can we go back to like being adventurers and saving the day? And they were all like, yeah, sure.
yeah, and I think that's also a very interesting point, because obviously, so I have a bias, right? I have a bias to you because I know you both as a player and as a DM, right?
Hmm.
And I know that as a player, you love those intrigues. You love those little nuances. You like
Hmm.
knowing, kind of probing around, kind of figuring out the world, and kind of seeing, give you influence and influence those types of situations.
And that's
And
probably why it got to that point as me DMing. And then I realized I'm over my
yeah,
head.
yeah. So that's exactly right. And that's oftentimes what happens, is that the DM. So I said something very earlier in the podcast, and I meant that the DM should say yes more than they should say no, or they should try to. But what I also said was, or they should try. That also implies, to clarify my statement, you should say no if it does not make sense, for your world, for your storytelling, or for your play style as a dungeon master. And Nikki knows I'm the first person to say no. No,
Hmm.
sorry, because I care about the world, the lore, and my players. and only if it doesn't make sense. And I'll try to rationalize it with my players as well, because it's obviously from the perspective of the dungeon master, not as necessarily Bill. And then I try to delineate that almost as well. I always told my players, like, hey, listen, this is how I see it as the DM. As I see it as me, I try to meet my players, and that's when I'll do high low. If I can't come to an arbitration, I do high low. But you're right. I mean, sometimes as a player, you might be really good at those things, but as a DM, you might not be good at it. One thing I am not good at as a DM, I am amazing, and I will say this without ego, I'm amazing at combat descriptions. I'm amazing at world building. I'm amazing at those systems and understanding how those systems work. What I am not good at is I am not very strong when it comes to thinking outside the box of my players. So I'm very good. I can pretty much understand what my players are going to do, but I always have a player in my group who's always going to either outthink me, or they're just going to do something I don't plan for. That's every DM, right?
Hmm.
Like, but I also know, like, I've been playing this for so long that there's a part of me, kind of like what Nikki kind of alluded to earlier, like, and what Keith did. I know as a DM, I know intrinsically when that DM is struggling. I know, you kind of develop this ability where the tricks of the trade, and you can't, because you've been there and you learn through experience. So as a player, I'll help the DM. I'll say, what do you need us to do, and move it along, right? So not every player does that. not every player not every player will help your DM. There are players who still have that mindset of, like, hey, it's us against him, or it's us against her.
Yeah, I've actually had it where, so Ashley ran our last game, and she did Dragon Heist, and that was fantastic. And then we took like a at one point she wanted a break and she wanted to try a different game, so we tried a Monster of the Week / D&D game, which I honestly had a ton of fun with. It was based off Cthulhu, or based off H.P. Lovecraft world, and in the Dreamland we were D&D characters, and we were in this horror-esque Lovecraftian world. But in our real life world, we were Monster of the Week, and we were like normal people. And I loved the concept of it. But because this was the first time she was building her own game, she asked me for help on doing it. So the way we did that was I became a cultist, and I was like the spy basically, but I was also co-DMing. So she did all the DMing herself, but I was like that background person where she could bounce ideas off of, and I could also interject with like, "Oh, hey, don't forget," during the game.
I really like that, and I really like that a lot. And there's a few reasons why I like that a lot. Number one, it gives kind of that burden of hey, I don't know what I'm doing, right? It gives that kind of like that safety net of, like, hey, I have someone who's going to help me
Hmm.
if I fall, right? Because we often, like I said, we as people, we don't want to look foolish in front of the people we respect, love, or like. We don't want that. So I like it for that reason, number one. Number two, what I also like is that sometimes it makes it easier when you can really bounce ideas off of somebody. Like,
Yeah, I love it.
sometimes it's just really great. I can tell you, before the age of Twitter and the internet, and really even sharing things on forums, sometimes you really just had to kind of play the game by yourself and see if it made sense. And you kind of had to kind of beta test and play test your own stuff. And we now live in such a collaborative world, and really a world that's trying to be inclusive the best that it can, where you can if you have that ability where you can bounce ideas off somebody to get their, not only their diversity, but their equity as a human being. Absolutely, that's another reason why I really like that. um, and to kind of build off that, and this is Nikki's experience as well. When Nikki started her first game, I did that for Nikki, and I think that's
Hmm.
100% true, right?
Yeah.
And also, to be clear, I know, like, the show has talked about certain issues before with relation to people's mental health, or and burnout, because there
Hmm.
is D&D burnout. It exists. You can get burned out really, really easy, or really, really overwhelmed by DMing, because you're going to have players who, you know, I think there's a disservice and I want to be clear, and this not could probably be a popular opinion. I think there's a real disservice when players say, "Well, hey, it's not as good as my other table," or
Oh,
"Hey,
please don't do that.
yeah, or "Hey, my DM over there does it this way." I don't think that helps our hobby. I think it actually discourages people from trying. I also think instead of focusing on those good games, focus on the fact that this person has taken time out of their day to make you a game,
Hmm.
and that they're putting themselves on the line to really try to put some entertainment out there. So it's incumbent on you as a player to also help guide the DM through those lulls, through those moments, and give them words of encouragement. Really tell them, like, hey, listen, you're doing a great job, or hey, take them aside. That's what I mean by also conflict resolution. It's so important that players give feedback to the DM, but do it in a way that's respectful. And DMs should do it the same way and say, like, hey, what do you like about the game? What do I need to tweak?
Hmm.
Or say, hey, listen, man, or hey, listen, I really like your game. I think it's really good. I think you should do this, this, and this. What do you think? Have a conversation. Don't dictate. Have a conversation. And what I often hear is, people be like, oh, I go in that game and I don't like it, or I go in that game and and I also want to add to that point. Not every game is for you.
Yeah.
Not every game is going to be for you. I know you've talked about it on the podcast before, so I won't go too deep into that subject, but there are going to be a table to use the most recent D&D controversy, right? There's going to be a table where there's going to be everyone at that table who thinks having a wheelchair in a game is not a good idea, and they exist, and
They're wrong, but they exist.
they're 100% wrong. I want to be clear on my stance. They're 100% wrong, but they exist. And you know what? Because our hobby is about inclusivity, they're entitled to find like-minded individuals and find that game. That's what I mean. If there's something you don't like, it's not incumbent on you to sit in that table. It's not. And 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 it's also important that session zero, that pre-planning stages of world building, it's so important to understand what everyone's expectations are. And if you don't do that. And if you don't have that, I know, Nikki, you've talked about the green, yellow, red system.
Hmm.
Having those safeguards for your players, having those abilities for your players to be able to have an open door policy at the table, and also with the DM, right? They're so important. And if you don't establish that, you're gonna run into situations where your players disappear, or where you just don't know what's going on, and then one day everyone's like, I hate this game, and you're like, what happened? It's because you never gave the opportunity to your players to give that feedback, or to really play that lead role as mentor, and as kind of like the leader at the table.
Hmm. Yeah. I lost my train of thought.
Hey, that happens with you.
I know. It's annoying. I really wish it'd stop. I think, though, that might be a good place to end because it's been an hour and a half almost. It's been a wonderful hour and a half. And we definitely need to do this again because I'm pretty sure you and I could talk for a decade and still not have things to not talk about. Even though I'll probably just repeat my same stories over and over again the entire time. But that's what you get when you're friends with me.
No, you know what? I'm very grateful to have come on the show. I'm very grateful to have this conversation with Nikki. I think for everyone listening at home, she really is somebody who is so passionate about the hobby. Uh, and she's somebody who should be a hobby champion. And I'm very grateful to know her, and hear her journey, and hear how she's influencing others, and really allowing people to learn and experience different perspectives in a really fun and collaborative way. There's so much to talk about with Dungeons and Dragons and role playing games in general. And yeah, I would like the opportunity, if you want me to come back on. I could, like I said, we could talk about the hero's journey. That's an episode itself. So um, I would love that opportunity, and more importantly, you know, keep the conversation going. And I hope really people really engage Nikki, and really keep it going, guys.
Yeah. Do you want to shout out anything? before we end?
No, actually, you know what? I'm probably the only guest you're probably going to come have on the show that isn't. I came on to support my friend Nikki. I came on to support the hobby. I'll shout out Beholder to No One. They're really an amazing podcast. Her and Greg,
I've never heard of those guys.
they're really good. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great projects out there. I mean, if I was going to shout out anybody, there's Project Apellion. They're really great. You should follow them on YouTube. He's creating an amazing system where it allows for narrative gameplay and it allows for non-DMing games in a
Mhm.
game where a DM is supposed to be in. I really recommend. His name's Jacob Wibs. He's from the other side of the ocean. I'm sorry, Jacob. I'm so sorry. You also will know him by Double Proficiency. Her name's Anna. She is making this amazing book about plants and herbs and thinking of like the lore of that in Dungeons and Dragons, which I think is wonderful.
I think I've seen that on Twitter.
She's actually one of your followers, so yes, you actually have seen it before. It's 2 times proficiency on Twitter. The only other people really that I would, if I was going to call anybody out, and we know we talked about it before the podcast, is actually
Mhm.
resting glitch face. Amazing Shadowrun podcast. You guys should follow them, support them. They're really great. Nikki described them as the Golden Girls meet Shadowrun. That is accurate. I really recommend season 1. It's fantastic.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining. And everybody, please go. If you have any comments or want to continue the conversation, you can do so on Twitter at Beholder to No One or Facebook at Beholder to No One if you want to talk to Greg. You can find these podcasts wherever podcasts can be found. Also, you can find us on YouTube, at least with our actual play. And you can also find us on our website at beholdertoknoone.com, made by my husband, Keith. If you want to hire him, hit me up and I'll hook you guys up. But anyway, keep being awesome, guys, and keep playing D&D. Bye.